Okay, we're now in Module 5, Unit 2, and the issue now is to estimate the costs of a project. Now, what we're really aiming at this stage, in this step, is to come up with some preliminary financial estimate, which really means that the partners in the end have some common understanding of the financial size of the project, and that they recognise that they've got a serious possibility of meeting any financial requirements. Remember, these projects generally require some degree of co-finance for each partner, and it is essential that the partners take a view as to relatively early on as to whether or not they are likely to be able to meet their financial obligations. So the best way to do this at this stage is, in function of what we already know, especially with regard to the outline of the activities, then we should try to come to some cost estimate. This is not a full budgeting exercise, but it should be sufficient to allow us to see whether we've got the resources for the project, whether we can justify them to our chief executive, and also make a judgment as to whether the project is worth going ahead with. In other words, does it seem to offer value for money? So, as we say, it's not a full budgeting exercise, but we can't be naive at this point. We must know, for example, is this project going to cost each partner organisation €2,000 or 20,000 or 2,000 or 10,000? We need some realistic assessment of what we're talking about here. We don't need an exact figure, but we need something that's realistic. And in a project like this, unlike an investment project, it should be possible at this point to arrive at a figure which is relatively realistic. And with that figure in mind, and especially the figure which tells each partner how much they will have to put up in terms of co-finance, then we can make some judgment about the benefits and see whether they clearly outweigh the cost. So how do we do it? Well, if we look in this slide, we can see already on the left hand side the main areas you would expect to find, the main areas of expenditure you would expect to find in a transnational cooperation project. There may be some others for certain projects, but these are the obvious ones. We need to estimate a unit cost. For example, international travel. We're just assuming that for one person to travel internationally to one meeting is a €500 return flight. Now, it might be a bit more, might be a bit less, depends on the destination, but this is a rough exercise, so we'll put in 500. Okay? And we do similarly for all the other obvious expenditures, and we arrive at the figure which tells us that the overall total is likely to be €28,000. So this particular project is relatively small, doesn't look particularly expensive. Now, then we need to analyse this a little bit further, and of course this depends on the programme that we have in mind that might finance it. And remember, and of course, in this example we're assuming a somewhat fictive situation, which is that each partner will receive 75% subsidy to cost. In other words, the program will pay for 75% of each partner's expenditure. In practice, it's probably not going to be like this. There may be differences to the rate of 75% depending on the program, and there may also be differences relating to where, in which country the partner lives. But this is simply for means of illustration, and we can see that each of the partners here is going to have to find €1,875, and collectively they must find €7,000, which is 25% of overall cost. Now the question is, of course, if in the end each partner has to find something like this, can they? Well, in this particular project you might say it doesn't look very challenging, but of course this is an illustration only, and in many projects the amounts could be substantially more. The other thing to remember is that you don't get your money reimbursed. You don't get your expenditure reimbursed immediately, and practically that means that you're likely to have to pay, each partner is likely to have to contribute to the covering expenditure up front, and there will be a delay in payment. So practically there's an issue of cash flow here, and depending on the size of the project, this could be quite substantive. So the questions then, when we get these figures roughly worked out, the questions we need to ask are the following. We need to ask some questions about the efficiency of this project, or the cost effectiveness of the project. That's to say, the relation of inputs to outputs. We have to, for example, look at what it's going to cost us, and we say, you know, would it have been easier simply to go on a training course? If the subject of the project is about development of staff, we might say, well, look, this is a very expensive way to develop skills for the staff. It would have been easier to go on a training course. Or if we're talking about development of some methodology, we might look and say, well, look, we could have simply gone out and bought a methodology off the shelf. Or we could have gone and got a consultant to do certain work for us, a study or whatever, and we would have come up with the output much more quickly and much more cheaply. In other words, the question really is, are we going to get something out of a transnational cooperation that we could not have got from some other intervention, such as a simple training? And is it worth the money we're likely to have to pay for? And this is fundamentally what you have to justify to your chief executive. When you go saying to your chief executive, we're going to need to put up €1,875, and we're going to have to cash flow this project for several months at a time, pending reimbursement, you've got to be able to tell them that this makes sense, that the benefits outweigh this cost. So that's why this is important, because if you can get the chief executive on board at this stage, then you've effectively got a green light and you can comfortably move on to complete the project proposal. So, a warning with regard to what we've said here. Different programs have different rules on co-finance, different rules on what is an eligible cost. So not all costs may be claimable. Many programs operate different co-finance rates for different partners from different countries. Some allow you to count your labour, that's to say the hours that you work on the project, as a kind of contribution in kind, and some do not allow this. So you have to check with the rules to find out whether in reality you're going to have to pay money as co-finance, and whether and how much that's likely to be. So this is not something that we can solve for you at this point, other than to say this is why you need to be looking at a financing program pretty early on for your intended project. And one final word here is to say that, of course, if the cost of a project was not so great, it could be that even if there's no program existing, you still decide to do the cooperation. That's not absolutely excluded, but if that was the case, you would want to keep the costs of the cooperation as low as is possible.